Welcome. You've found your way to a quiet space, one far removed from the noise of now. Here we travel backwards, gently, into the still corridors of history, where life moved to a rhythm slower and far more predictable than ours. Tonight we journey to Edo period Japan, a world that existed between the 1600s and mid-1800s. A society built not on freedom, but on rules. A place where beauty and boredom existed side by side. Where rituals replaced spontaneity and silence often spoke louder than words. This isn't the Japan of roaring samurai battles or sweeping anime tales. This is the Japan of worn tatami mats, slow-burning lanterns, and 1,000 bows exchanged in a single morning. Our story will unfold in 4 calm chapters. First, we'll quietly slip into the sandals of a low-ranking samurai with no war to fight. Then, we'll walk slowly through the haunting tale of the 47 Ronin and ask whether their devotion was truly noble. From there, we'll glide behind the curtains of the floating world, the serene, secretive districts where geisha danced, poured tea, and rarely revealed who they truly were. And finally, we'll find ourselves at rest in the estate of a powerful daimyo, where stillness and status governed every breath. So find a comfortable place, let your breathing soften, and if stories like this help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps keep this quiet space alive. You're also warmly invited to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, drifting off to the same old story. This is life in Edo, Japan, where the boredom was beautiful. You wake early, not because of urgency, but because your body knows no other rhythm. The room is dim. Light filters through a thin shoji screen, that delicate lattice of wood and paper that separates the world from your futon. The floor beneath you, tatami, is cold and slightly springy. It smells faintly of dried straw, ink, and the must of quiet winters. You sit up slowly, careful not to ruffle your sleeping robe. Everything, even rising, has a form. You light a tiny flame, maybe from an oil wick. The warmth flickers up the paper wall. A wooden basin of water waits nearby, cold from the chill of the morning. You wash your face with slow hands. No one is watching, but it must be done properly. You are a samurai, a word that once meant to serve. Now it means something more complicated. I'm not a warrior, but a watcher. You wear 2 swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi. They are more than tools. They are symbols of class, of heritage, of discipline. But you do not draw them. You haven't drawn them in years. There are no more battles. The Tokugawa peace has lasted generations. War is forbidden, conflict is regulated. What remains is duty, not the kind that involves marching or fighting, but the kind that involves waiting. You serve a minor administrator in a district near the edge of the city. Your tasks include managing rice deliveries, overseeing land records, or politely enforcing the many laws that regulate even the size of a merchant's house. Sometimes you inspect grain. Sometimes you sit for hours in silence, recording tax ledgers with a soft bristled brush. You are not needed as a soldier. You are tolerated as a symbol. On the slow collapse of honor, your stipend comes not in silver but in rice, a fixed allotment, passed down since your grandfather's time. It has not increased, but the cost of everything else has. You buy ink sticks that crumble too easily. Your robes grow thin in the knees. You stretch a bundle of firewood for weeks longer than it should last. Still you bow to the clerk who shortens your allotment. Still you bow to the merchant who gives you poor credit. To complain would be a loss of face. To show need would be shameful. You nod, you bow, you accept, because you are samurai. Whispers of side work. You've heard of others like you. Samurai who've taken on secret work. Some tutor the children of rich merchants. Others work under false names as guards, scribes, or calligraphers. One man you hear carves elegant combs from sandalwood and sells them under his wife's name. Another delivers sake at night, his swords hidden in a cloth bundle. These are disgraces, but also necessities. Everyone understands, no one speaks of it. Discipline without purpose. You train in the courtyard behind your narrow home. Daily always. You swing your sword in perfect arcs and again, though the blade never touches flesh. The repetition is comforting. It is the one part of your identity that still feels real. You kneel in still meditation afterward, listening to your breath and the sound of birds nesting in the roof tiles. But no one watches, no one cares. There is no enemy, there is only silence. A home filled with etiquette. Your home is not large. 2 rooms separated by paper screens. Shoes never cross the threshold. Swords are always stored on the right. Tea is served clockwise. Guests sit facing east if possible. Even the smallest rituals carry meaning, and meaning is all you have left. You kneel for meals, facing the smallest altar you can afford. A sliver of incense rises from a clay bowl, a faint stream of smoke scented with sandalwood. There are days when you do not speak at all. Dreams you do not admit. You sometimes imagine what it would be like to live without formality, to laugh too loudly, to eat with your fingers, to stretch out your legs, to speak without lowering your eyes. But you never do these things, not even alone. The rules live in you now. They are what remain of the code, Bushido, that gave your ancestors purpose. Loneliness in a city of order Edo is not quiet, but it is controlled. Vendors call out their wares in strict tones. Children walk in pairs, fires are forbidden after dusk. The alleys are swept, and even filth is expected to fall in line. You pass a procession of nobles one morning and bow low, your knees nearly to the dust. They do not look at you. They are above you. You are above the merchants. The merchants are richer than you. This is the order. It does not bend. Those who fell away. You once knew a fellow samurai who began to wear merchant's robes in secret. He drank too much, he gambled. He was last seen working as a translator for Dutch traders. An unforgivable betrayal. You do not speak of him, but you remember. Another samurai you admired took up ink painting. He said the strokes of the brush gave him peace. His work now hangs in the tea house of a wealthy bookseller. He signs it with a false name. Thus the sword you cannot use your katana rests in its stand beside your sleeping mat. It gleams, still sharp. Still true, you oil it once a week, polish it with fine paper and bow to it, quietly alone. But you know, deep down, it will never draw blood. Not in defense, not in rebellion. Not in ceremony, it is an heirloom. Not a weapon. A day like all the others, evening falls again. You light the small lantern. You boil rice with dried daikon radish, humble, clean enough. You sweep the floor, your robe smells faintly of smoke. The city hums in the distance. You lower the screen door. You kneel, you bow. You write a haiku in your notebook, though you are not a poet. You lie down in silence. The katana rests beside you. You are a samurai. And that is all. Let us now leave this small, quiet room behind and walk, slowly, into a story that still echoes through temple gates and candlelit inns. A story of 47 men who found purpose in a single act of ritual revenge, an act so precise it still stirs debate. The story of the 47 Ronin is one wrapped in silence and solemnity, a tale not of loud battle cries but of quiet resolve and patient waiting. Imagine yourself in Edo during the early 1700s, where the city thrums with strict order and gentle rituals. In this world, samurai once known for their swords now walk the streets as officials and retainers, their weapons more symbol than tool. Among them was Lord Asano, a man bound by honor and tradition called to serve in the shogun's palace. But fate turned against him one spring day when he struck a court official named Kira inside the sacred halls, an act forbidden and fatal in consequence. Ordered to take his own life, Asano left behind a band of loyal samurai suddenly cast adrift without a master, known as Ronin. Among these Ronin, 47 pledged to avenge their lord. They lived in shadows, pretending to have fallen into ruin, hiding their true purpose beneath masks of indulgence and despair. The leader, Oishi Kuranosuke, feigned a broken spirit while carefully plotting their course. For nearly 2 years they waited, watching, planning until the moment was right. Then, before dawn on a cold winter's day, they struck with quiet precision. They entered Kira's home, subdued his guards without unnecessary harm, and found Kira hiding. Offered a chance to meet death with honor, Kira refused or remained silent. Oishi took his life swiftly. The Ronin then carried Kira's head to the grave of their master. Bowing deeply in a gesture heavy with meaning, they surrendered themselves to the authorities not as criminals, but as samurai who had restored order in their own way. The shogunate faced a dilemma. The Ronin had broken law but upheld Bushido, the samurai code of loyalty and honor. Ultimately, they were ordered to die by ritual suicide, an end fitting their rank and deed. Their deaths were somber and composed, and their graves remain a place of quiet reflection. Visitors still come, offering incense and silent prayers for the men who chose loyalty over life. In a world of strict rules and stillness, their story endures, a reminder of sacrifice, order, and the heavy weight of duty. Beneath the strict surface of Edo society flowed a gentler rhythm, one that shimmered quietly just out of reach. In the shadows of curfews and courtyards, an entire world unfolded, known simply as the ukiyo, or floating world. It was not a place marked on maps, but rather a space of the imagination, an escape from rigid duty full of music, scent, candlelight, and artful silence. This was the realm of the geisha. To the outsider, it might seem like a world of pleasure, full of graceful movement and soft laughter. But behind the white-painted faces and elaborate hairstyles was a tightly structured life, governed by invisible codes and years of training. Imagine stepping into a tea house in Kyoto or Edo, where the floor is warm beneath your feet and incense curls slowly through the air. Outside, lanterns flicker. Inside, a geisha moves with practiced precision, pouring tea without a sound. Her gestures are deliberate, every motion designed to convey calm, elegance, and composure. Becoming a geisha was not a casual choice. Girls often entered okiya, or geisha houses, in childhood. Their days began before sunrise and ended well into the night. They learned music, dance, poetry, calligraphy, and the subtle art of conversation. Their lessons were long and disciplined, shaping not only their skills but their posture, their gaze, even the way they sat and walked. In public, they became performers of presence. Their words were few, their expressions controlled. Their beauty was not just in their appearance but in their timing, their restraint, the soft power of suggestion. In a world where directness was often rude, a geisha's talent was knowing what not to say. Despite popular assumptions, geisha were not courtesans. They did not sell intimacy. Their role was to host, entertain, and accompany, with elegance and art as their tools. Their clients were often officials, merchants, or wealthy patrons seeking an evening away from the stiffness of formal life. Inside the ochaya, or tea house, time seemed to slow. Shamisen music floated gently through the air. Sake was poured. A fan was opened with a soft snap. Games were played, poems exchanged, and laughter drifted like smoke. But even here, everything had its proper place, its unspoken boundaries. The geisha world was built on balance, form over spontaneity, beauty over boldness. They were not free in the modern sense. Their debts to the house, the pressure to maintain appearances, the long apprenticeships, all came with their own weight. Yet within those constraints, they created something rare, a life devoted to the aesthetic, to the fleeting moment, to the performance of serenity. For some, it was a life of quiet empowerment, mastering their craft and choosing their path within a male-dominated society. For others, it was a life of limitation, where every gesture had to be perfect, every interaction rehearsed. Today, echoes of this world remain. In Kyoto's Gion district, one might still glimpse a figure in silk, her steps quick and measured, her face unreadable in the twilight. The floating world has not vanished. It has simply receded like mist in the early morning. To walk through it, even in memory, is to be reminded that not all beauty is loud. Sometimes it is whispered, measured, hidden behind a folding screen, waiting for those who are still enough to notice. The estate of a daimyo in Edo was not built for extravagance alone. It was a space of formality, structure, and constant watchfulness. From the outside, it looked serene. Rows of wooden buildings nestled within carefully raked gravel paths, paper windows glowing faintly with candlelight. But within its walls, every action had meaning, and every silence served a purpose. Imagine the quiet of early morning, where a servant walks swiftly in straw sandals across the veranda, the sound muffled by the matting underfoot. Shoji screens slide open with a whisper, revealing the dim light of a private chamber. The daimyo has not yet stirred, but the household has already come to life. A daimyo was a lord but not a king. He answered to the shogun, owed taxes, kept troops, and lived under strict regulations. In Edo period Japan, every movement of the daimyo class was tracked. They were required to spend alternating years in the capital under a system called sankin kotai, a kind of political surveillance wrapped in ritual. These men did not travel lightly. When a daimyo made his journey to Edo, hundreds of attendants accompanied him. His banner flew high, his retinue moved like a mobile village, and back at home, his estate was a hive of quiet labor, filled with officials, scribes, tutors, guards, cooks, and servants, each fulfilling their role within a perfectly ordered hierarchy. The daimyo himself lived by routines as rigid as any peasant's. Morning prayers or meditations, formal meals prepared with seasonal balance, meetings with retainers, decisions about land, law, and legacy. His family, particularly his wife, often remained in Edo as a kind of insurance, held by the shogunate to prevent rebellion. Even in luxury, there was no true freedom. Every room in the estate served a purpose. The guest chambers were sparse but elegant, decorated with ink scrolls and seasonal flowers. Tatami floors softened footfalls, and low lacquered tables held warm bowls of tea. The master's quarters were slightly elevated, a few steps above the others, not for comfort, but to reflect status. Even elevation followed rank. At night, the estate did not sleep easily. Lanterns glowed dimly in hallways. Guards walked slow circuits beneath the eaves. In the inner rooms, the daimyo might receive guests, host quiet banquets, or retire to read poetry written centuries before his birth. The silence was not restful, it was maintained. His children were educated in the Confucian classics, trained in swordsmanship, and instructed in the duties they would one day inherit. His servants followed spoken and unspoken rules, always aware of their station. Even casual conversations were often measured, couched in layers of etiquette. And yet beneath all this structure, the estate pulsed with human life. Laughter in the kitchen, quiet complaints exchanged behind closed screens. A garden being raked not just for beauty but for a moment of solitude. Servants whispering stories of the daimyo's youth, or of the ghost said to walk near the well at night. In the eyes of commoners, the estate was a world of unreachable grace. But inside its walls, it could feel like a gilded cage. Reputation ruled every interaction. A single misstep could stain a family name for generations. And for all the power a daimyo held, he too answered to the rhythms of a nation built on order above all else. As the sun set, shadows moved gently across the rice paper walls. Tea was poured, doors were closed, and another day ended without fanfare, just as the last had ended and the next would begin. The daimyo's estate was not just a residence, it was a theater of status, a machinery of discipline, and a monument to a world where beauty and burden were deeply entwined. Nightfall in Edo arrived slowly. There was no sudden switch from day to dark, only the gentle dimming of a sky untouched by electric light. Candles flickered behind shoji screens, casting soft golden shapes across the floor. Lanterns swayed outside doorways. The city hushed itself in stages. In most homes, privacy was not built from walls but from distance and behavior. The thin paper screens that divided rooms let light and sound pass freely. Footsteps were not muffled by carpets but echoed lightly on wood and tatami. To live in an Edo home was to live in awareness of others. Close, careful, always adjusting. Imagine a modest household where the parents and children all share adjoining rooms. There is no lock, no true separation, just a thin screen and the quiet understanding not to intrude. Voices are lowered at night. Coughs are stifled. Even laughter becomes subdued. In a way, silence itself becomes a form of etiquette. The architecture encouraged restraint. Doors slid open with a soft swish, not a creak or clang. Mats were smooth to absorb rather than project sound. Even the placement of a teacup was done with intention, to avoid harsh noises that might travel too far. This closeness wasn't only physical, it was cultural. The idea of the self was porous. One's actions reflected on the household, the neighborhood, the class. Solitude, when possible, was not found in space, but in posture. Looking away, folding hands, walking slowly beneath trees. And yet, in the quiet of night, some moments felt entirely private. A woman brushing her hair in a dimly lit room. A man setting out his sandals for the morning. A child falling asleep to the sound of insects in the garden. These ordinary rituals, small and unspoken, shaped the emotional rhythm of life. In wealthier homes, the patterns were similar, only more layered. There were more rooms, more screens, more layers of removal, but the concept held quietude, not separation. Even in a daimyo's estate, secrets whispered behind folding fans could be overheard by servants on the other side of a wall, no thicker than paper. When disasters struck, fires, floods, earthquakes, the fragility of these homes became clear. But for most nights, in times of calm, the delicacy felt natural. You didn't need walls to feel safe. You needed routine, familiar sounds, the rustle of robes, the wind against the screen, the soft hiss of a kettle beginning to boil. There is comfort in thin walls when everyone agrees to be gentle, when the neighbors bow instead of shout, when the silence is not lonely but shared. To fall asleep in Edo was to hear the city breathing, lightly, constantly, without rush. And to know behind your wall of paper someone else was doing the same. And just beyond the paper walls and candlelit stillness of the home, the city of Edo moved in quiet rhythms of its own. If the elite lived behind sliding doors, the common people lived between stalls and lanterns, where class was fixed, and ambition rarely stretched beyond the next sunrise. Among these streets moved the merchants, the lifeblood of the city's economy, and yet in the eyes of the official hierarchy, near the bottom of society. Samurai held status, farmers had virtue, artisans shaped beauty, but merchants simply sold things. Their wealth grew, but their standing did not. Walk through the early streets of Edo and you'd see them at first light, pushing carts, unrolling fabrics, sweeping storefronts. They worked in pairs, in families, in silence. Children helped balance tall stacks of firewood or rice bales. Older men counted coins with careful fingers. Beneath every action was a kind of dignity born from necessity. Shops were small but ordered. Wooden signs hung above the doors painted with kanji to identify each family's trade. Some sold tea leaves, others paper or pickled roots. The wealthier merchants stocked fans, silk, lacquered boxes, luxuries for the rising middle class. But regardless of income, the rules remained unchanged. No matter how successful a merchant became, his place in society stayed where it began. Evenings brought their own kind of rhythm. Lanterns were lit one by one, their soft glow pooling beneath the eaves. Pigeons rustled on rooftops, shutters closed gently. But the shop stayed open late. Candlelight flickered across rows of folded cloth and stacked baskets. Business continued quietly and steadily into the night. Many merchants lived above or behind their shops, rooms with low ceilings, narrow stairs, and the ever-present smell of paper, oil, and pressed herbs. At mealtimes, families gathered in small spaces, sharing bowls of rice and pickled radish, eating quickly between customers. Their lives were not marked by leisure but by repetition. And yet within that repetition there was a kind of comfort. Despite their low rank, some merchants grew extraordinarily rich. They lent money to impoverished samurai. They owned ships, warehouses, even land. But they could not buy respect in the official sense. They could not wear swords. They could not rise in station. So instead they expressed their success in subtler ways. The fabric of a kimono, the style of a calligraphy scroll, the thickness of a tatami mat. These details spoke quietly but clearly to those who understood them. On festival days, the merchant districts came alive. Street musicians played flutes and drums. Children danced with painted masks. Sweet smoke from grilled mochi drifted over the crowds. But even here, the division remained. The samurai might attend but rarely mingled. A bow here, a nod there, carefully measured. At the heart of it all was the game of go or shogi, played by candlelight on slow evenings. Merchants played patiently, each move a metaphor for the life they lived. Cautious, strategic, always aware of limits. In Edo, a merchant could own more than a lord and still bow lower. And so they did, day after day. Head down, eyes alert, hands steady. The floating world passed above them. The samurai's world remained beside them. But in between, these shopkeepers and sellers held the city together, quietly, relentlessly, without praise or promotion. And when the lanterns dimmed and the shop shutters closed, the people of Edo turned, as they so often did, to images, printed, folded, admired, and quietly tucked away. Not all stories were told in words. Some were whispered in brushstrokes and sold by the stack, for just a few coins at a time. This was the age of ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. In narrow alleys near the riverbanks or behind the stalls of booksellers, you could find these prints for sale. Some were dramatic scenes from kabuki theater. Others showed graceful geisha beneath blooming cherry trees. But many simply captured the pleasures and pastimes of a city that dreamed of escape. Tea poured just right, lovers behind bamboo blinds, fishermen waiting under the moon. Made from carved wooden blocks and pressed by hand, these images were both art and commerce. They weren't precious in the museum sense. They were collected casually, admired briefly, then stored in wooden drawers or pasted into albums. A merchant might keep one beside his futon. A samurai's wife might hide a favorite beneath a stack of more respectable prints. These images belonged to no one and everyone. They offered a window into a life slightly removed from the one people lived. A bit more beautiful, a bit more daring, always fleeting. The women were drawn with long flowing sleeves, the men with confident postures. The seasons changed in the background, petals falling, rain streaking gently down a rice paper umbrella. And not all of it was polite. Hidden among the more elegant scenes were shunga, erotic prints not crude but intimate, detailed and humorous, sometimes exaggerated, They were meant not for scandal, but for quiet amusement. Lovers tangled beneath patterned robes. Couples exchanged glances heavy with suggestion. These prints were passed between friends or hidden in the folds of traveling robes. They weren't spoken of openly, but they weren't entirely secret either. They were simply part of the world. Artists like Hokusai, Utamaro, and Hiroshige became known for these images, although their fame was often more posthumous than profitable. In their time, they were craftsmen, paid modestly, working within guilds, carving scenes with care and repetition. Their woodblocks wore down, their fingers ached, and yet through their prints the city breathed. Everyday life appeared, captured in ink. The tilt of a street vendor's head, the arc of a bridge after rain, the idle pose of a cat sleeping beside a brazier. The prints offered no judgment, only observation, and in that a kind of gentle reassurance. They reminded people that life, even in its ordinariness, could be beautiful. In a world where speech was careful and ambition was bound by class, these printed moments offered a quiet kind of freedom, a space to imagine, to feel, to dream. By candlelight, a shopkeeper might study one before bed. A courtesan might turn the pages of an album between appointments, and in the calm of early morning the prints were folded away again, until the next time they were needed. A glimpse, a gesture, a dream pressed into paper. And while dreams lived quietly on woodblock prints, reality had its own way of returning. Edo, for all its order and artistry, was a city balanced on the edge of disaster. Behind the calm faces and precise gestures everyone knew, beneath them the earth shifted. Around them the wind could change. Fires were a constant threat. The city was built of wood, paper, and proximity. A single ember from a kitchen hearth, a toppled lantern, or a stray spark in a crowded alley could send flames leaping across rooftops before anyone could shout. These were not occasional tragedies, they were expected. The people of Edo called fire the flower of the city, blooming far too often, and so they prepared. Each neighborhood had its own fire watchtower, and citizens were trained in the rhythm of evacuation. When the warning bell rang, buckets were filled, tatami mats were rolled, children were gathered, important scrolls and family altars were rushed to safety. Everyone knew what to do, though they always hoped never to do it. After fire came flood. The rivers that fed the city also threatened it. Heavy rains could swell the waterways until streets disappeared beneath murky currents. Small wooden bridges bent and creaked. Vendors tied their carts down. And as the water receded, the city dried itself and moved on again and again. In the face of these dangers, the people of Edo obeyed rules not out of fear, but because rules were the thread that held the city together. From how to greet a neighbor to how to fold a letter, expectations were clear. There was safety and predictability. And yet, in the quiet margins of these rules, other things stirred. Things less visible than fire, but just as consuming. Love, for instance. The kind of love that wasn't permitted. Between social classes, between a samurai and a merchant's daughter, between two women in the confines of a tea house, between a temple apprentice and a married nobleman. These stories were whispered, never written. They lived in glances, in brief meetings under moonlight, in coded poems left folded in the hollow of a tree. Everyone understood the risks. The consequences could be harsh, disgrace, exile, or worse. But the city itself, in its own way, made room. The same walls that let sound pass also let secrets hide. The same alleys that carried away floodwater also sheltered lovers too cautious to be seen by day. Many such romances ended not in tragedy but in quiet surrender. A letter burned, a meeting missed, a name forgotten out of necessity. And still they happened again and again. Not as rebellion, but as small human choices made in a world of larger forces. It was in these moments, both fragile and unremarkable, that Edo revealed its true heart. Beneath the samurai code and merchant ledgers, under layers of etiquette and ash, lived a population simply trying to carry on, to love a little, to laugh when they could, to survive the seasons. And when fire came again, or flood, or a rule too tightly drawn, they would bow, adjust their robes, and begin again. The city endured not because of power, but because of quiet resilience. And as dawn returned once more, that same quiet resilience took form in broom-sweeping alleys, buckets clinking against water troughs, and barefoot steps on cool stone streets. The city of Edo did not truly wake, it stirred, gently, predictably, like a tide returning to shore. Before the shutters opened or the first rice pot boiled, certain workers were already moving. Their names were rarely recorded. Their roles were not praised in poetry, but without them, the city's delicate rhythm would have crumbled into chaos. There were the street sweepers, mostly women, children, or the elderly, carrying bundles of reed brooms across their backs. They walked the narrow lanes at first light, sweeping dust, leaves, and bits of paper into woven baskets. The sound was soft and rhythmic, swish, 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 a gentle brushing that signaled the day had begun. In busier districts, young men carried large wooden buckets filled at communal wells. Water was needed everywhere for cooking, cleaning, rituals. These carriers moved with practiced grace, balancing their loads from bamboo yokes across their shoulders. The water sloshed gently with each step, but rarely spilled. Further out, others made their rounds, collecting the city's waste, night soil as it was called. This was not a task of shame. It was part of the city's fragile ecosystem. Human waste was sold to farmers outside the city walls, used to fertilize crops. The work was smelly, yes, but organized, regulated, and essential. Each household had a designated collection schedule. It was an economy of necessity carried out in silence. Temple grounds also came alive early. Monks swept fallen blossoms from stone paths. Novices lit incense and struck prayer bells. The slow resonance of a temple bell carried over rooftops like a soft announcement. Time was moving again. Not far from these temples, vendors set up stalls in the half-light. Some carried trays of breakfast, steamed buns, grilled fish, rice balls wrapped in leaves. Others sold paper, combs, sandals, or simple cloth. They greeted one another with quiet bows, not loud chatter. Edo mornings were orderly, unhurried, shaped by repetition. Even the animals played a role. Cats prowled rooftops. Pigeons fluttered down into open courtyards. Dogs, half domesticated, curled up near the warm stones where vendors would soon sit. In wealthier homes, servants began their routines. Rice was washed, floors swept, water heated. Every task had its time, nothing was rushed. If a servant moved too quickly, it suggested disorder. Calm efficiency was the expectation, even behind the scenes. And as the city slowly brightened under the morning sky, the larger world began to stir. Shoji screens opened, merchants rolled up awnings. Students hurried toward temple schools with wooden tablets tucked under their arms. Officials left their homes with quiet formality, their footsteps measured and deliberate. But none of this would have happened, at least not smoothly, without the people who woke before all others. The ones who cleaned, fetched, carried, lit, and prepared. Their work wasn't recorded in the histories of daimyo or warriors, but it was part of the story. Every day, every season, every generation. In Edo, even the simplest tasks were part of a pattern. A broom sweeping dust from a stone path, a hand cupping water at a well, a bell echoing softly across a neighborhood roofline. It wasn't glamour that made the city work, it was rhythm. And those who moved first kept it steady. And as the workers faded into the background, their tasks completed, the city began to move according to a rhythm older than bells and more subtle than the turning of gears. Because in Edo, time was not something kept in a pocket or hanging on a wall. Time was listened for, smelled, felt guessed by light and known by sound. There were no ticking clocks on city corners, no hourly chimes to mark progress. Instead, Edo measured time with temple bells and the patient burning of incense. It was a city governed by cues. Sunlight on paper walls, the first crows of morning, and the smell of rice beginning to steam. The most familiar sound was that of the Joya no Cane. The temple bell struck 108 times on New Year's Eve, but smaller temple bells rang daily as well. These tones drifted over neighborhoods, signaling the rough division of hours into 6 parts: morning, midday, evening, and the in-between spaces. They weren't precise, they didn't need to be. Time flowed like the Sumida River, steadily, without pause, without numbers. At home, some families used incense clocks, delicate arrangements of incense sticks or powdered trails that burned in measured increments, a curled scent that marked time by fragrance instead of hands on a dial. When a certain aroma reached the far room, the tea was ready. When the trail ended in ash, it was time to close the shutters. More intricate were the wadoke, the Japanese mechanical clocks modeled after Western imports but adapted to local needs. These clocks didn't divide the day into equal hours. Instead, they used seasonal hours, shorter in winter, longer in summer. Their inner workings were adjusted constantly to follow the sun. They were clever, beautiful, but rare. Most people never saw one. Instead, they learned to tell time by the world around them. In the market districts, the arrival of certain vendors marked the hour more reliably than any machine. The tofu seller's call meant mid-morning. The noodle man came at dusk. Even the sound of sandals against stone had a cadence, slower before noon, quicker just before night. And then there was the sun itself. People in Edo were tuned to the arc of its passage, the way it filtered through bamboo blinds, the angle it struck a doorway. A housewife might pause her sewing not by a clock, but by how the light had moved across the floorboards. A child would come in from the alley when the shadows grew long and gold. The rhythm of the seasons layered over the rhythm of the day. Cherry blossoms meant spring, but also more light. The buzz of cicadas meant summer's height. A certain crispness in the air told you it was time to pull the thicker robe from its wooden chest. There was no need to check a calendar. The body simply knew. In schools, students recited passages in the morning light and were dismissed when the incense stick burned to its end. In bathhouses, the hour was marked by who came in and who was leaving, not by appointment but by habit. And so the city moved forward, not in measured strides but in slow agreement. Everyone knew what came next, not because they were told but because they had watched it happen every day of their lives. In Edo, time didn't tick. It drifted, fragrant, melodic, and familiar. The hours weren't kept, they were remembered. And in a world where time flowed like incense smoke, the spaces people inhabited followed their own quiet rhythms. The Japanese home in Edo was more than shelter. It was a place of rules, rituals, and unspoken expectations. A place where every gesture mattered, and every surface whispered a lesson. Step inside and you would notice it at once, the shift in the air, the faint scent of tatami straw, the sound of sandals left at the threshold, the hush of sliding doors closing behind you. Homes weren't loud, they didn't need to be. Their architecture spoke through silence. At the heart of the home was the tatami, woven mats of rice straw, soft underfoot, delicate in smell and precisely measured. The number and layout of tatami in a room wasn't random. It followed patterns. Some avoided the number 4 associated with death. Others followed centuries-old rules of balance and proportion. A poorly arranged tatami floor was more than a design error. It was a social misstep. Shoes never touched tatami. They stayed outside, aligned neatly. Entering the home barefoot or in socks was both hygiene and humility. The simple act of removing your footwear marked the first shift, from the outside world into a space of thoughtfulness. Inside, the rooms were mostly empty. A low table, a cushion, a scroll in the tokonoma, a small alcove reserved for seasonal art or flowers. Space itself was the luxury. Possessions were stored out of sight. Clutter was considered noise. Even how one sat mattered. On knees for formal moments, cross-legged or with legs tucked gently to the side in private. Posture was language, movement was message. Conversations were quiet, indirect. Praise was deflected. Complaints were softened into silence. The home taught these things, not with words but with habit. A child learned the rules not by instruction but by watching. Watching how tea was poured, how a door was closed, how a guest was welcomed. Tea especially was a ritual of care. Not just what was brewed, but how. The placement of the cup, the temperature of the water, the timing of the sip. A simple offering of tea could say more than a letter. It was apology, greeting, gratitude, respect, all folded into one steaming bowl. Certain topics were never discussed inside. Illness, politics, money. These belonged outside, in the street, in the marketplace. The home was a place for calm and continuity, a place where time slowed, where routine became comfort. There were taboos, too. Stepping over someone's bedding, placing objects unevenly on the altar, speaking too loudly in the morning. These weren't enforced by punishment, but by glances, a pause, a silence, and in that silence, correction. Seasonal changes were marked subtly. In summer, reed blinds replaced heavier curtains. Fans were laid out by doorways. In winter, charcoal braziers warmed hands and kettles alike. The house breathed with the seasons, adjusted itself to the weather, and reminded its occupants to do the same. Even saying goodnight followed a rhythm. A nod, a drawn screen, the gentle clink of a teacup placed back on its tray. To live in a home in Edo was to live inside a story told without words, a story shaped by careful movements, warm wood, and the soft hush of footsteps across straw. It wasn't the walls that made a home. It was how one moved inside them. And within those quiet homes, behind paper walls and warm bowls of tea, another kind of rhythm unfolded. The rhythm of teaching. Of passing on what couldn't be written down. Because in Edo, children didn't just grow. They were shaped slowly by stillness. From an early age, a child learned that movement was noticed, that noise echoed. That silence was something you could enter like a room. They were not asked to entertain or assert themselves, but to blend, observe, and listen. It began with watching how mother folded laundry, how father adjusted his sandals, how older siblings bowed before opening a sliding door. There was no lecture, no list of rules pinned to a wall. The rules lived in action. In wealthier households, boys might study calligraphy, math, or Confucian classics with a tutor. Girls learned seasonal poetry, modest embroidery, or the subtleties of arranging plum blossoms in a shallow dish. But these lessons were as much about posture and patience as knowledge. And even in poorer homes, where books were fewer and hands were always busy, children were learning how to sit for long stretches, how to serve tea with steady hands, how to speak softly and wait for others to finish. These weren't punishments, they were preparation. Play, when it came, was quiet and clever. Pebbles turned into games. Paper became boats or spinning tops. Bamboo toys clicked gently. Laughter was allowed, soft and brief, but outbursts were rare. A child who laughed too loudly would earn a look, not a scolding. That was enough. Children followed parents to market, to temples, to visit neighbors. They didn't lead conversations. They stood beside, listened, and absorbed the way the world flowed around them. It was how they learned timing, tone, grace. When guests visited, a child's job was often to kneel silently at the threshold, pour tea, and leave without a word. This wasn't neglect, it was instruction in presence, in respect, in learning the weight of one's footsteps. They were also taught to wait, for the rice to cook, for the older sibling to speak, for the rain to stop before leaving the house. Waiting became a kind of invisible thread running through their days. It taught them patience without the word ever being said. Even at bedtime, the routine carried weight. Feet washed, robes folded, futons unrolled with quiet care, shadows stretched across the floor. Outside, a distant bell. Inside, the settling of bodies into stillness. No screens, no stories, just the slow fading of day into dark. There was comfort in these patterns, in knowing what came next, in feeling part of a world that expected less performance and more presence. It didn't matter if you were bright or bold. What mattered was how you listened, how you moved, how you learned to belong. In Edo, childhood wasn't about expressing the self. It was about learning the self's proper shape, gently over time in the spaces between words. And once a child learned how to move, how to listen, how to wait, there came the lessons in how to be seen. Not loudly, not directly, but through fabric, through color, cut, and the silent weight of tradition. In Edo Japan, clothing didn't just cover the body. It translated the self. The kimono was more than dress. It was a sentence spoken without voice. Everything about it conveyed meaning, the color, the length of the sleeves, the pattern stitched or dyed across its surface. Even the way it folded, always left over right unless dressing the dead, was an act of respect and memory. Children wore simple, soft robes, their patterns playful, tiny rabbits, scattered leaves, swirls of water. Older girls wore longer sleeves, swinging gently like willows as they walked. A girl approaching adulthood might have bright reds or deep blues, but as a woman matured, her colors softened. Earth tones, pale greens, washed indigos. Men's robes were more reserved, subtle grays, browns, blacks, often with a small crest near the collar. A merchant's robe would be sturdy, tightly wrapped, modest in cut. A samurai might wear layered silks, the family symbol clearly displayed. Even without speaking, one could read another's station at a glance. Season-dictated fabric. In summer, the yukata, light, breathable, worn after baths or in the home. In winter, heavier weaves, lined layers, padded collars. The robe adjusted not only to the climate, but to the day's mood. Rain suggested darker shades. Clear skies brought out patterns of cranes, waves, or pine needles. Obis, the wide sashes tied around the waist, spoke too. A tightly knotted obi meant formality. A softer wrap suggested ease. The placement of the knot revealed the wearer's age, gender, sometimes even intent. Geisha tied theirs elaborately in the back. Young children had theirs tied in front, where they could be adjusted by a mother's hands. These details were not seen as vanity. They were social language. Clothing in Edo was not about standing out. It was about fitting gracefully into one's place, expressing thoughtfulness without demanding attention. And care went far beyond what one wore, folding garments after use, airing them in the sun to preserve the fibers, wrapping silks in paper during humid seasons. Every robe told its own story, and every crease remembered its wearer. There were taboos, too. A woman mourning did not wear bright color. A laborer would not wear silk. A young man would not don his father's crest until he had earned that weight. Everyone knew these quiet rules. They were followed not out of fear, but as part of the harmony that made the city breathe. Even in the poorest quarters, pride was taken in appearance. A neatly mended sleeve, a clean collar, a child walking hand in hand with a parent in matching indigo robes. These things mattered. Not because others demanded it, but because the act itself showed care for the self, for tradition, for the balance of things. And in the early morning or just before night, you might see someone brushing dust from their sleeve with the back of their hand, smoothing the folds, tying the sash just so. It was not performance, it was peace. Because in Edo, the way you dressed was not about standing out. It was about belonging, quietly, respectfully, beautifully. And as the robes were folded, the shutters drawn, and the sandals brought inside, the day in Edo eased toward evening, not with alarms or announcements, but with the slow hush of firelight blooming against paper walls. Evenings were never rushed. They drifted in on the heels of twilight, carried by the scent of cooling rice and the distant splash of water poured into a basin. The sounds outside, the clatter of carts, the call of vendors faded slowly. Inside the home, light shifted. Candles were lit, but sparingly. Firewood was precious. In wealthier homes, small oil lamps burned low, their soft glow flickering across painted scrolls. Families gathered in close circles, not always to speak, but simply to be near. A grandfather refilled a pipe. A mother brushed a child's hair. The movements were slow, practiced, often silent. No one hurried. There was no screen to scroll, no schedule to race toward, just the gradual folding of the day. For some, evening meant ink. Students sat cross-legged before low tables, carefully copying characters onto smooth paper. Brushes were dipped in black ink, ground slowly from a stone, the scent sharp but familiar. Every stroke was deliberate. A missed line wasn't corrected in haste, it was rewritten with calm. For others, it was time for craft, mending robes, sharpening tools, braiding cords, or folding papers into careful shapes. The rhythm of hands at work brought comfort. It wasn't about productivity, it was about presence. Children listened to stories, softly told, half-whispered. Not dramatic tales, but gentle parables. Folk tales of cranes who became wives, foxes who brought snow, old trees that remembered your name. The line between story and silence was thin. A voice might trail off into the rustle of wind through bamboo, and that too was enough. Fans moved slowly through the air, stirring the heat left behind by the day. In summer, doors remained open just a crack, letting in the hum of crickets and the faint sounds of neighbors settling in next door. Privacy in Edo wasn't about walls. It was about respect. Everyone heard everything, and no one spoke of it. Even bath time followed its own quiet order. A wooden tub, hot water poured carefully, the sound of ladles, the steam rising in a still room. Families bathed one at a time, washing not just the body but the day itself away. It was ritual more than routine. Meals, if not already finished, were simple by night. Warm rice, pickled vegetables, sometimes soup not spoken over, not rushed, just shared. And when the last candle burned low, the home softened. Futons were unrolled, the sound of fabric against wood, the brushing of teeth with salt. A mother humming to a child too old to need it, or pretending not to. Outside, the city held its breath. A temple bell struck in the distance. A gate creaked, the last cart passed, and inside, shadows thickened. Sleep came not as escape, but as a natural part of the pattern, like the turning of a page, like the extinguishing of a lamp. In Edo, night was not the opposite of day. It was its quiet mirror. And when silence settled across the rooms of Edo, it wasn't total. Not quite. The city never went mute. It breathed, it creaked, it whispered through bamboo and brushed softly past paper. Because Edo sounded different. Its homes had no thick insulation, no double-paned glass, no concrete to swallow footsteps. Instead, there were sliding shoji, paper stretched over thin wooden frames. They let in light and they let in sound. Conversations became murmurs through the walls. Laughter, just soft enough to recognize. A broom across the neighbor's floor. The knock of a tea bowl gently set down 2 rooms away. You never felt alone, not fully, but you were rarely disturbed. People moved quietly because noise traveled easily. Respect lived in that restraint. In the alleys outside, another sound ruled. The clack of geta, those tall wooden sandals worn by men and women alike. Their rhythm echoed off the stone. A slow, hollow click, 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 not hurried, just steady, like punctuation in the city's rhythm. Even indoors, the floors had a voice. Tatami softened steps, but wooden beams beneath them creaked ever so slightly, enough to remind you someone was nearby, enough to know the house was alive. Vendors had their own music. The tofu seller struck a small metal triangle. The goldfish peddler sang a short melody. The sweet potato man called with a rising tone that floated through streets and courtyards. These were not advertisements, they were invitations. Familiar, predictable, almost comforting. Temples marked time with bells. Not loud or alarming, just long, deep notes carried by wind. One bell in the east, another to the south. They didn't compete, they lingered. Even animals joined the chorus. Dogs barked not in packs but alone, once, maybe twice, then settled. Cats padded silently across roofs but knocked loose the occasional pebble. Crows called at dawn. Crickets in summer made the night sing. In winter it was the crack of wood as it burned, the slow hiss of water poured into a kettle, the distant snap of a robe shaken out before bed. And when it rained, it didn't hammer, it tapped. It threaded through the bamboo gutters, fell in soft beads off curved roof tiles, and struck the paper doors like a drum with no urgency. Rain was company, not interruption. There were no horns, no engines, no overhead announcements. Time passed not by alarms, but by texture. And if you listened closely, the whole city had a rhythm. A slow cadence, a kind of breathing. People didn't fill silence, they respected it. Spoke softly so others could sleep, pray, or think. And in turn, they received that quiet back. Even now, if you were to walk the old quarters in the early morning with no tour guide and no map, you would hear echoes of it. A gate creaking, sandals brushing stone, a voice singing 3 notes before fading into the mist. Edo was never loud, but it was never silent. It simply listened to itself. And now, as the last candle of Edo's night fades from memory, you may find yourself still listening. Or drifting. Perhaps the wind outside your own window sounds a little different now. Maybe the room feels quieter, not because the world has changed, but because you've just spent time in one that never rushed to begin with. The rhythm of Edo wasn't fast. It didn't push, it pulsed, gently, like water in a garden basin, like ink drying on parchment, like the sound of geisha sandals passing just once beneath a full moon and then gone. Its people lived by unspoken rules, shared gestures, carefully chosen silences. They worked, prayed, slept, and aged within wooden rooms and seasons that repeated like lullabies. Their days were structured but never tight. Their lives small but not insignificant. And for all its elegance and harmony, Edo was still difficult. It was often uncomfortable. Disease was common. Water had to be carried. There were rules for everything. When to bow, where to walk, how to fold the bedding. Being born into the wrong class meant staying there, no matter how clever or kind you were. But it was not a loud kind of suffering. It was the quiet kind, a persistent undercurrent of restraint, of knowing one's place and staying within it, of patience, repetition, and sometimes resignation. And still, there was beauty in the repetition, in the way seasons unfolded, in the smell of morning incense and the sound of rice washing in a clay bowl. There was dignity in folding a robe with care, in greeting a neighbor with a nod and no words. Life in Edo Japan didn't demand attention. It asked for presence. And maybe now, as you lie still, wherever you are, you can feel the weight of that stillness too. Maybe you've found it soothing. This journey through rooms without clocks, homes without locks, cities without sirens. Maybe you're asleep already. If not, you're close. Let the paper walls fade. Let the bell in the temple tower ring one last time. And as it echoes far away into the past, remember, even the most ordinary days can become extraordinary once you slow down enough to truly listen. Good night.